One moment.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
There we go. I found it.
Perfect. Yes, there we are. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see slides. Yes, yes. Okay, I'm just going to assume that that's a yes. Perfect. Okay, excellent. Give me 1 second just to get everything situated on my side here. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Joe is going to be the wonderful moderator here today. So if you have any questions or any issues, let me just get all my participant screen pulled up here so I can see if you raise your hand, and then also my chat. All right, Zoom on my little windows here. Perfect. Okay, so thank you everyone again for taking the time today to learn about testing Angular applications with Cypress. So here are the repository and link and the slides link. It's also, we can post that in the chat as well. We'll be referencing those repeatedly throughout the workshop. So I'd recommend having those open like in another tab. The slides as we go along, you can feel free to jump ahead if you like during the breaks or anything like that, but I'd recommend not getting too ahead if you can help yourself. So I am Cecelia Martinez. I am a success engineer at Cypress. So I spend the majority of my day talking to Cypress users about their test strategy and their test suite, helping them overcome technical issues, helping them decide, how and what to test, and also helping them integrate with the Cypress Dashboard and with their CI. I also do a lot of trainings and working on kind of getting people up and running. So that's what we'll be doing today. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. I also like to do a lot of volunteer work. I'm a Women Who Code track evangelist for Women Who Code front end. And I'm also on the Out in Tech leadership team and helped found the Atlanta chapter of Out in Tech. You can find me at Cecelia Creates on Twitter and GitHub. I'm also at Cypress Cecelia for anything Cypress related. But in most places on the internet, you can find me as Cecelia Creates. So I'm going to kind of go over what we're going to be working through today. So like I said, there's going to be kind of break periods every hour. We're going to do a 10-minute break and then an optional 10 to 15-minute Q&A. So if you have any specific questions, you can either use the question and answer functionality here in Zoom in order to submit those questions for that Q&A period. Anything urgent, you can also leverage the chat as well. So the first hour, we're going to talk about getting started. There's going to be 7 different interactive activities, like coding activities that we do throughout the workshop. You may have noticed on the repository that there are different branches with solutions for each of those activities. So feel free to leverage those if I encourage you to try and do it yourself first, but feel free to leverage those solution branches for if you need help getting started on a certain activity or anything like that. But we'll be working through these periodically throughout the workshop. But so for the first hour, we're going to talk about, getting started. We're going to talk about Cypress itself, installation, folder structure, and configuration. And we're going to do a couple of easy test activities. The second hour, we're going to talk about testing our application, diving deeper into how you structure your tests and all the different types of commands and selectors within Cypress. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be doing an assertion deep dive for the last hour of the workshop, where we talk a lot about different types of assertions that you can make, specifically also around network requests. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the workshop setup, ideally you should have done this, been able to get this up and running already. So if everyone could please raise your hand if you have access to the repo and slides. And again, please raise your hand if you have access to the repo and slides. Okay, just need a couple more hand raised so we can make sure that everybody is up and running. So if you could please make sure that you have your hand raised as you have access to the repo and slides and you were able to get them open. And we do have quite a bit of attendees here today. So if you are able to just respond as quickly as you can whenever we do ask for hand raises, that'll allow us to be able to keep moving things forward. Okay, so I have about 76 hands raised. We'd like to see a few more. Let's see. If you don't have access to the slides or the repository, it's like Tomas, Sonal, Raj, Priya, Yuvraj, y'all don't have your hands raised. Any issues getting to the slides or repository? Yep. Okay. So, and then also if you could keep your hand up. So we're at about, you have access to the repo, but not the slides. So are you not able to access the slides if you click on it, Priya? I'm sorry, if let's see. I guess we can put this link back in the chat. Let me see here. Let's double check. Yeah, thank you, Joe. Okay, so again, please keep your hand up if you have completed the installation instructions and you can see the Cypress test runner. Okay, so Aldo, Velasco, Amanda, Gerard, Hanyu, Iris, Jeffrey, Manuel, Mark. If you have any issues, okay. All right, so if you aren't able to access the slides, it sounds like it may be a issue of it having the slides.com blocked. So just make sure that you're following along with the slides on the screen. We'll be showing them the entire time. Okay, yeah, thanks, Joe. That's helpful. You may need to use mobile hotspot or incognito browser. And if anybody has any specific issues with the with being able to install and then use the Cypress test runner, if you could also pop that in the chat. I want to make sure that everybody who is going to be coding today is able to get up and running. Yeah, that's a good idea. Let me see if I can download the slides. Actually, I don't know if we have the email addresses of all the attendees. But I can, what I can do as well is after the workshop is make the slides available as a PDF file on the repo in order for people to be able to access them. Let me see if I can do that actually.
Also, this will be posted to YouTube. It's being recorded right now. And when it is posted to YouTube, we can try to get that into the description for the video.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Okay, give me 1 second. I'm just getting this pulled up here. Just waiting for also a few more hands. I do see that not everybody has their hand raised. So if you do have an issue installing or running the Cypress test runner, please post that in the chat. Is there a particular node version we should be using? So on the repository, there's the Cypress system requirements link. You need to be using node JS 10 or 12 and above if you're using NPM to install Cypress. Yep, that error is fine. So Anthony posted an error that here's seen in the chat. So that's just because we have not set a base URL or written any tests yet. So that's perfectly normal to have that output, Anthony. Okay, so we have 76 people with their hand raised. I don't see any other issues in the chat, so I'm going to give it like a last call. And if at this point, so anybody else, if you have any installation issues or any issues running Cypress, please put that in the chat now. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and move on with the instruction and getting started. Okay, so go ahead and everybody can put their hands down. Actually, I think I can maybe do that. Oh, okay. Y'all are quick. Thank you very much. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So we talk about, why end-to-end testing. I don't think I will need to go too much into this with this group. It sounds like we have some pretty avid testers here. But we talk about end-to-end testing specifically to increase confidence in your application that's going to function the way that your user expects. The primary reason that everybody that I talked to that uses Cypress for end-to-end testing, the primary goal is to reduce the amount of bugs in production. Specifically on top of that, you can ensure critical user functionality is maintained, aka you don't roll out any breaking changes or cause any regression. You can also write tests that mimic your user behavior, not the code-based structure. So with unit testing, the tests are very tightly coupled to the application structure. However, the application structure doesn't always actually accurately reflect what the user is doing with your application. So I wanted to share this blog post. These are 3 common questions that people who are skeptical about Cypress or end-to-end testing in general. So I wanted to share this here with written by Gleb just in case you have any questions on end-to-end testing, or if you're experiencing at your organization kind of any pushback against end-to-end testing that might kind of help point you in the right direction. So why Cypress specifically? So Cypress has two products, essentially, or two portions of it. There's the free and open source test runner, which is what we're going to be working with today. It runs in a browser alongside your application code. So every time that you're running a test in Cypress, you're running a test in an actual browser. It has Mocha, Chai, and then the jQuery selector library already built in. So if you're familiar with either Mocha, which is a test runner, or Chai, which is the assertion library, then you already have a head start on using Cypress. So we try to leverage already existing popular testing libraries so you can get up and running quickly. So it has built-in waits and retries in the API of Cypress. So what that means is that it will retry commands up to a certain period of time in order to combat flakiness in your application. So we have that at the command level. And then additionally, with the release of Cypress 5.0, we have test retries on the test and then the suite level. So you can configure it to say, rerun your test up to 3 times. And then if it passes one of those, if it passes, and it passes, and if it fails, it fails, but then it'll flag it as that being something that was retried using the Cypress dashboard. So you can help better identify flake, and then also kind of control the level of tolerance that your organization has for flake by whether or not, you retry tests or how you implement that workflow. The Cypress test runner has a lot of features built in for improved debugging. So if you've ever had to debug a failed test and figure out what went wrong, it offers features like time travel, which allows you to step through the DOM at each command, at each step in the test. It also provides really detailed error reporting, gives you the stack trace of the error, screenshots and videos, and then it allows you to open up the test code where the failure occurred. And then we also have, because we have great documentation. I learned all about Cypress from our docs, and because we're an open source software project, we have a lot of different community plugins and a lot of contributions from the community, which I think just makes Cypress even better. I love the fact that it's open source. Okay, so the repository that we're working with today already has Cypress installed. So I'm just going to go through really quickly kind of what you would do if you were starting from scratch. But so if you had to install Cypress from scratch, Cypress is not a CLI. It's not something that you install globally. You install it in your project. So in the root of your project directory, you would run npm install Cypress or yarn add Cypress in order to add it to your project. Once you've done that, the very first thing that you need to do is open the test runner. And when you open the test runner, a couple of things will happen. Your system will validate or verify that Cypress can run, and then it will open the test runner. And if it's a brand new project, it's going to put a bunch of example tests in your test folder to be able to see what Cypress can do and get started. Again, the project that we're working with today has already had Cypress installed, so you don't need to do these steps, and you didn't need to do these steps in order to get started. Okay, so taking a look at the folder structure of our project, let's go ahead and actually open up in VS Code. So this is the Cypress testing Angular project up in VS Code. Hopefully everybody can see okay. Let me know if the font is too small. I can blow it up larger. But as we can see here, we have kind of our Cypress folder, and these are automatically created whenever you open Cypress for the first time. Integration folder is where our test file is. So we have an empty test file. Additionally, there's a plugins folder if you're using any kind of third-party plugins. A fixtures folder, which allows you to save data or files in order to access during your test. And then a support folder, which essentially allows you to import custom commands. So if you have any, we'll talk about Cypress custom commands a little bit later on today. So that's the folder structure. Again, there's not much to see when we first get started, and that's okay. The Cypress also comes with a configuration folder. That is our cypress.json. This gets created whenever a project gets created, and it has a lot of different types of configurations that are available. All of these links in the slides will click directly to our documentation. So if you take a look at the configuration documentation here, you can see all of the different options that you can pass through here. And so there's quite a few, definitely. We're only going to worry about a couple today. But the one that we definitely recommend, sorry about that, as a best practice in setting is the base URL. So the base URL, what that is it's the URL for your application. So if you are running locally, it'll be localhost, and the port number. If it's going against a staged environment or a test environment, that's where it'll be. It doesn't necessarily make sense to type out your URL every single test or every single time you're going to be visiting your application. So we recommend storing it in your configuration in order to just access that at any time you like. And so with the base URL, this will actually prefix anytime that you use a sci.visit. So sci.visit is the command to visit a URL. In this case, whenever you have a base URL, it will prefix so you can automatically. So as long as the base URL is set, you don't have to type the local host here. It'll just prefix automatically. Additionally, you can set things like viewport width and height. This can be really helpful if you're testing in browser and web and then also for mobile. There's a wide variety of different configuration options, but those are the two that I wanted to highlight specifically. Okay, and that leads us to our first activity. So the first activity is to configure your test suite. So in your cypress.json, and again, you can kind of use the documentation here to guide you. We're going to go ahead and set a base URL. Additionally, as a recommended best practice, you want to add some scripts to your package.json. Whenever you run Cypress locally, as you've noticed before, probably you have to use npx, right? Or you have to use in order to download that. So what's more kind of a best practice or what's easier for you is if you add a script that you can just use where you do npm run sci open and sci run, and then you have the scripts outlined there instead. So we're going to take about 5 minutes and set the base URL in your cypress.json, and you can add sci run and sci open scripts to package.json. Like I mentioned before, we do have solutions for each of these activities as a branch. So in the repository, let me get this pulled open here. You can see here at the bottom that all the solutions are in a specific branch. So if you need help getting started, feel free to reference there. Otherwise, just take a few minutes. And as you finish this, go ahead and just raise your hand for me. So yeah, again, the solution here is on the activity 1. Okay, so the next thing we're talking about is test structure. So again, we're using Mocha, the Mocha test runner. So this will look familiar to you if you've used Mocha before. You can use either describe or context blocks. I just use describe because that's what I use. The first thing I want to point out, though, is in our test block, this reference types equals Cypress. So we're referring here to the Cypress IntelliSense. This allows you to have access to all the documentation and the commands and autocomplete when you're typing Cypress commands. So definitely recommend adding that. There's a couple of different ways that you can actually configure it right into your VS Code as well. So when we talk about the structure and the syntax of our test file, so within a spec file, again, so in our application code, in our test code, we have our integration folder and we just have a spec.js file. And you can write in TypeScript or in JavaScript, it's up to you. These tests are all written in JavaScript just to make it easy, so that it's more accessible for everybody. But you essentially start with a describe block and you pass through a name for that describe block. The reason that you use a describe block to house everything is that so you can leverage hooks. So you have access here to the before each, the before, the after each, and the after hook. really only recommend using before each typically, but essentially what before each will do is any code that is passed through there will run before each it block. And again, your it block refers to your actual individual test. So you may have a describe block that has one before each hook that sets up that logs into your application, for example, in front of every single test. Typically, I recommend using the before each hook to manage any kind of common state that, or for example, you're visiting, like your site.visit URL. Typically, the before each, if you're going to be visiting the same page of your application across the entire spec file, that's a great place to put that. If you need to log in a user, if you need to set up your state in any way, before each is a great way to do that. Also, if you need to clean up state, I do not recommend using after each or an after hook to clean up state. You always want to do it essentially in advance. So this is the syntax and the structure for how you organize the test file itself. We're going to start really simple, and we're going to go ahead and open up the test runner now and talk about what that looks like and how we can use it while we're writing our tests to help us with that process. So in our VS Code or our IDE, the first thing we want to do is start our application. So let's just, we can go into our scripts and we can see that to start, we can just do npm run start. And this is going to serve our application. Yeah, so one of the things that we don't recommend about using after each is essentially what can happen is if a test not necessarily fails, but if it crashes or something breaks in a test run and you're using an after each to clean up any kind of state or to clean up any kind of setting, then that may never run if the test actually fails out. So by using a before each to actually clean up and then set the state, which is what we do in the Cypress Real-World app, you can kind of reduce the variability there if in case anything does go wrong during your test run. Okay, so now that we have our application running, we can go ahead and open up Cypress. So just do npx cypress open. Again, I'm working off the starter branch right now, so I don't have all my nifty scripts that y'all just wrote up. So this is a Cypress test runner. And if we click on the actual test spec, it'll automatically pull these up. This is probably the same thing that happened to you, but it just says no tests were found. We cannot detect any tests in the above file, write some tests and rerun. Very helpful message from Cypress, thank you. Some things I wanted to point out in the test runner itself is, you can see your runs from the dashboard if you're connected. There's also the settings. So here you can see your configuration, and you can also see how it's been overwritten. So on your test runner, you'll see that your base URL will not be null. It'll be whatever you just set it to. And it'll be blue because it's being set in your cypress.json file. So if you're ever questioning why something's running a certain way or what's going on, this is how you can see what's been configured and at what level. Additionally, you can also set any proxy configurations. Will you be able to see them here? You'll actually set them elsewhere. You can choose what file will open code in. We have Visual Studio Code. And you can also implement any experiments. So we have component testing, fetch polyfill, and then our experimental route to support. You can choose which browser you run in. This will only select whatever browsers are available on your machine. Cypress does come installed with Electron. So I also have Chrome. If I had Firefox, it would be there as well, or Chromium Edge. So that's the Cypress test runner. And again, when you need to run your test, you have to start your application first. And in this case, our application is running at our local host. And that's why we have set our base URL. And that needs to be running in order for us to run tests against that. So let's see, where are we on time? Okay, cool. Yeah, doing pretty good. All right, so for our next activity, I'd like you to go ahead and add the IntelliSense / directive to your test file. And then write a describe block with a single it test that visits the base URL of your application. And remember, we talked about how if you have a base URL set, then when you go to sci.visit, it'll automatically prefix. So all you have to do is just the /sci.visit/ as long as you have your base URL set. And then once you've done that, essentially just write a very simple test that visits your URL, run the test, and see it in action. And remember to start your application server first. So if everyone could put their hands down first before we get started, that would be great. That way we can just know. Okay, awesome. And then we'll go ahead and take, y'all are pretty quick. We'll take 10, well, it says 10 minutes, so we'll see what happens. If you could raise your hand as you finish, and then if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or the Q&A as we work through this. Okay, excellent. So we're we're 20 minutes above the hour. So it looks like we have 65 hand raised. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's go ahead and take a break. Again, there's a solution is on the activity 2 branch. If you have any questions or want to continue working on this, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and we're going to follow that up with some Q&A time. So you can either take a break, keep working on the activity if you like, or you can stick around for some Q&A. But we'll go ahead and plan on at the next top of the hour, starting right back up with some more instruction and activities. Okay, there's a question in the Q&A. That's a really good question. And I kind of want to just, Aaron asked about some code here. I'm just going to copy and paste this code snippet, actually.
Sweet.
And
yeah, I wasn't watching the clock when you started the break. Are we about the Q&A time then?
About 3 minutes. Yeah, I did it right. Yeah, right at 20 minutes ahead. So this code block, we can kind of see here, this line 12, const header equals sci.get. So Cypress, a sci.get doesn't actually return anything. It yields an object, but it needs to be chained with Cypress in order to be able to make assertions off of it. So what you actually would do is just sci.get expect header to equal. So you essentially just do the assertion right off of the command.
Now, in this, now on line 12, there's a header variable that doesn't exist, right? So
yeah, thank you. So
you just remove that and just say expect. What would you do?
Sorry, I'm not used to expect as much. To equal, and then conduit.
Okay, so it will. The expect will automatically unwrap that H1 into its text content there when you do the to equal?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so it's like it gets that item. Oh, no, sorry. Sorry. I'm used to should, so I'm just going to change this to should. Sorry. Yeah, so have text conduit. Thank you.
Oh, okay. That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah,
cool.
That makes, yeah. So Cypress, the gets, the selectors yield an object, but it has to be chained correctly in order for it to actually run in order. So if you want to assign something to a variable, then we'll talk a little bit later about how you can assign something to an alias, and then you get it that way with Cypress.
Cool.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of it returns a promise, kind of. So that's a good question, Aaron.
Yeah. So here, is this operating synchronously or asynchronously?
It's operating serially. So it's kind of, yeah. There's a really good section in our documentation about, oh gosh, where is it? It's in one of these. Yeah, it's under conditional testing, I think. Somewhere in here. Yeah, so it has to do with element existence and, let's see, serially. Async. I'll have to find it. We have like a section in our guides that's like all about how Cypress is async, but it's also not. Introduction to Cypress. Here we go. Commands are not asynchronous. Okay. So what happens is it's actually like a chain of commands. So you do sci.get and then you chain off of those, the commands. And so when you make assertions, commands run serially. So it actually takes all of the commands and it like chains them together to run. So if you have any kind of code that's outside of that JavaScript code, then it won't run. It has to be wrapped up in Cypress in order for it to run correctly.
Cool. So with some unit testing asynchronous patterns, sometimes you'll have to either return the promise or like pass a done callback. But it looks like in Cypress, that's not something you have to do. It all just kind of works as if it were operating synchronously.
Yeah, so Cypress test should really kind of read like English, right? So it should just say sci.get.should have text. And that makes a lot of sense when you read it out like that. So the same thing, we're sci.visit, we're getting an element and we're clicking on it, and the URL should include that element that we clicked on. Again, so you're not returning anything, it's just kind of, you're just clicking through and it's working that way. So this commands run serially. I'll go ahead and post that in the chat as well. This whole guide is good to read if you have any questions about the asynchronous, synchronous kind of combination of test code and how that works together.
All right, awesome. Well, I think we're done with the break. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here. It seems like space travel won, and then there was fly a fighter jet and visit Antarctica were the top 3. So,
okay. All right.
Cool.
We got some explorers. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it.
All right. Let's go ahead and move over to the Q&A. For the benefit of those who are going to be watching this later on YouTube, I think I'll just read out the question and then you can answer it. How's that sound?
Perfect.
Okay. Our first question comes from anonymous attendee. TDD in Cypress would be awesome to talk about if there's time.
Yeah, so TDD with Cypress, it's a little bit different. So with end-to-end testing, you really do have to have a functional application to be able to test against, right? So you have to be able to do at least some core functionality when you're getting at the point where you're actually testing from a user perspective. So I would say that it can be helpful to write the user journeys while you're in the process of kind of an early prototyping phase, having some user journeys in order to base your application development on, and then running those tests to confirm that the user functionality does work as a core. Like a lot of people use Cypress testing for acceptance testing, for example, and saying, okay, this new feature passes because we can do all of these different functionalities. So that can be helpful in guiding those kind of early prototyping or features. But as far as when you actually go to write the code, it may not be that one-to-one relationship that you get with unit testing. But great question.
Okay. Our next one comes from another anonymous attendee. Do you have any recommended plugins for either VS Code or Cypress plugins for Angular?
That's a good question. I don't personally really use any plugins with VS Code. I use like the I have that configured to get the IntelliSense code completion. Typically, people use Cypress plugins if they're trying to achieve a certain functionality that's not built in. So for example, we have the Cucumber preprocessor plugin. If you're using Cucumber syntax to write your test, that'll dynamically generate the Cypress test for you based on the Cucumber writing the actions and then also the feature files. Things like that. We have a plugin for code coverage, for visual testing, things like that. So if you're trying to do a component testing, different types of testing that aren't in the box with Cypress, then that's typically where I see plugins being used. So otherwise you can get a lot with just kind of using the IntelliSense. So
yeah, and I noticed that VS Code is very capable, and so in some ways, it eliminates the need for certain plugins because it just does a lot of this stuff for you.
It's kind of like with Cypress, like test retry started as a plugin. And once it gets popular enough, if we can just bring it into the application, then we do. So hopefully over time, you need less and less plugins, right? Or fewer and fewer.
That's cool. All right. Our next one from Kyle says, can you expand on why Cypress in a comparison to Protractor?
Yeah, so Protractor essentially is just like a wrapper around Selenium. So kind of the same issues that if you've used Selenium before, if you're familiar with that, you will similarly have kind of with Protractor, right? So you don't have the kind of you don't have like a GUI that you can test with like you do with the Cypress test runner. You don't get that live feedback during the debugging process. You also aren't running the test in an actual browser. So if that's specific to your user functionality, you don't have those kind of built-in waits and retries that make your test more reliable and less flaky. You also don't get access to we have the Cypress Dashboard as well. I'm not going too much into that today. That's a kind of like an add-on service that you can use, but it gives you additional insight to your test recordings and things like that. But even if you don't use that, you have the screenshots and the videos, and I know that you do get some kind of assets and things like that that you can leverage with other testing frameworks, but it kind of all just kind of comes packaged together with Cypress. So I will say that that's a lot of the things that I hear from Angular developers, right? I try not to use Protractor, or I just use Cypress a lot. So I may be a little bit rusty, but that's a lot of the things that I hear from people who've migrated to Cypress. So.
Yeah, and I mean, Angular CLI comes with Protractor kind of baked in. So I guess sometimes it might be a question of, well, if this is already here, why do I need to rip that out and use Cypress? But
yes, the nice thing is you don't really have to rip anything out, right? You could just add Cypress, write a few tests, see if you like it. And then over time, if you find that that's a much better developer experience for you and a test writing experience, then just start writing the new tests in Cypress, right? And it doesn't have to break anything that you already have. Yeah, that's a great point, Simon. Narwhal NX is awesome for having, they have Cypress built in, and it works really well with their dependency graph and everything. It's all good stuff. Sorry.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, we actually have a few questions that are related to Azure DevOps and continuous integration. Do you have any experience with, or do you have any example projects or documentation on how you would integrate that into builds?
Yeah, totally. So we have an entire continuous integration guide, and that does have a number of different examples depending on the CI providers. I know specifically as well on the Cypress Real World app, we have, it has Circle CI configuration, but they're working to also demonstrate that in other CI systems. But these will have, if you go to the Cypress example kitchen sink repo, this is where we have sample configuration files in standard. And then also if you want to do it in parallel, I know the question about parallel configuration came up earlier. This is where you can go in and see. So we have Azure CI. So you can come here and you can see this is a sample config file for running in parallel. And you could essentially just copy and paste this, just change whatever is specific to your CI and run that right there. We also do have Docker images that you can leverage that come pre-installed with Cypress and also all of the dependencies. And then we also have ones that include specific browsers. So if you wanted to run Chrome tests or specifically in as well, you can use the image that comes included with Chrome.
That's really cool.
Yeah, definitely recommend checking these out. If you have any questions too, we have a number of different webinars as well, like the people who have set it up specifically for their organizations. So in the documentation, again, under the examples, webinars, a lot of these have to do with actually setting up the UI. So I know that, there's complete code coverage. A lot of these have to do with actually how they set it up in their CI system specifically. So if you find a certain provider that you want to check out, you can typically find a corresponding webinar config file. Great question.
Super cool. All right, I think we have time for one more question before we move on, and then the rest we'll cover in our next Q&A break. How would you organize your spec files when you're getting too many? And is there any file name conventions or best practices?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Cecelia isn't like a good, so we have the Cypress Real World app, which is kind of our, like I said before, it's our flagship demonstration app that demonstrates real world best practices with Cypress. So it's an entire repository that you can just download, clone, and then it also has a bunch of Cypress tests in it. So we have API and UI tests, but you can see that these spec files here, bank accounts, new transactions, notifications, transactions, feeds, are very closely aligned with the actual application code itself. So if we go into the source file, this is built in React, and then the containers, you can see that our container names look very similar to our spec files. Now, you don't always want to do that. For a lot of modern applications, the views of the application or the containers tend to correspond pretty well to user behavior. So, user onboarding container, user settings container, transaction create container, that aligns with user functionality. But sometimes modern applications, so if you think about going to like a college website and having to look at all the classes and then sign up for a class and a course, you may have to visit like 3 different parts of the application. In that case, you may not have that one-to-one relationship between a view and between functionality. So in that case, I'd recommend organizing your spec files based on either feature or a part of the application or functionality, or if you have a certain role type, like you have an admin and user, maybe organizing it that way. But I would keep it either if you can tie it to the application, but only if that actually also corresponds to your user journeys.
Yeah, do what makes sense for your project.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you for your Q&A. Keep them coming, and we'll be monitoring them for the next Q&A break. Back to Cecelia. Cecelia, sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, you can call me Cecelia, Celia, Cece, Leah. I've heard all of it's good.
Right. Excellent.
Awesome. Okay, so now we're going to dive into our actual application under test and take a look at that and start writing some tests for it. So we take a look again back at our repository. This application under test is one that's it's a fork of an Angular real-world example application. So essentially really wanted to focus on the test writing. So we have an example application that, demonstrates some kind of different CRUD functionalities and things like that. But there's an API that backs up against it. We'll be talking more about the API a little bit later when we dive into network requests. But essentially the functionality of the application is it's a social blogging site called Conduit. It hits a live API. We can see the live demo here. Looks like a lot of people are making some articles and getting ahead of us. So that's awesome. But essentially, yeah, you're able to post feeds. You're able to post articles to a feed. You're able to log in and sign into a feed, and you're also able to kind of leverage some tags and stuff. I'm guessing this is a public API, so we have some goofy tags. But yeah, so that's the application that we're going to be testing against today. Again, pretty straightforward, but it's getting us to be able to focus on the test. So we talked about the test structure from a syntax perspective. Now I want to talk about what a test structure looks like from a behavioral perspective or from a structure perspective. So typical test steps. First things first, you have to visit the page. Cypress doesn't actually know to go to your application unless you tell it to, so that's where you see a sci.visit. Then you typically will query for an element. So you get to a page and then you want to do something. Now, the way that Cypress works is you have to have commands off of an element. So you can't just click. You have to click somewhere, right? And so that's why you say you have to query for an element in order to be able to action on it. Then you typically perform a command, and that can be click, type, trigger, double click. And then once you perform an action, you will make assertions based on what happens after that action takes place. And last but not least, you will repeat this as needed. So you will run through different steps. Along the way, you'll be making assertions, and you can definitely make multiple assertions per command. Definitely recommend doing as many as you need, but not too much. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then you'll repeat this process throughout your test until you get to the point where you've done your entire user story. So if we know how to write a test, we kind of need to know the pieces to use to write that test. So we're going to talk about the Cypress API. So the Cypress API is the application programming interface, and essentially it's the language that we use to write our Cypress tests. It breaks down into 3 major sections, at least in my mind. We have selectors. So we talked about how sci.get in our example that we just looked at here during the break. Sci.get will actually, you can use that to select an element on the page. We also have, and it works just like query selector, or if you're familiar with jQuery, you can also pass through like wildcards and things like that. But you're able to select by either an element type, an HTML element, the class ID, HTML data attribute, any kind of property on the HTML element. And I mentioned before, you can also do things like wildcard patterns. Sci.contains will just search for the text. So if you say, if you were to do it on this page here, if you did sci.contains Cypress API Basics, the test would pass. And again, sci.contains is kind of, it's like a selector, but it's also, can also be like an assertion itself, because the test will not pass if it cannot find that item. So it's unlike sci.get, where both of these will fail if it can't get the item, but you can use sci.contains and sci.get on their own if you want to just check for the existence of an element. So they're also self-asserting in their own way. Then we talk about commands. So these have built-in actionability checks, which we'll dive into a little bit deeper, but essentially it ensures that before it actually clicks, that the user could do the same, could perform the same function. So if a user couldn't click on it, Cypress won't click on it. And then finally, we have our assertions. So I mentioned earlier that Cypress has the try assertion library built in. You do get access to all of the types. So you have the BDD assertions and the TDD assertions. I use should for everything. That's just what I'm used to. But you can also definitely use expect. And then if you really want to, you can also use the TDD assertions as well for assert. So I probably see these used the least, but you can definitely still use them if you like. No one's stopping you. More power to you. So again, if you have any questions on the assertions, we have them in our documentation as well. But I would recommend checking out the try documentation specifically too, because this is going to give you a lot more robust information about specific use cases for if you have very granular types of assertions that you need to make. And then, so we're going to dive back into the Cypress selector playground. The Cypress test runner to demonstrate the Cypress selector playground. So you can see here, it allows you to essentially find out what selectors are if you don't have access to your application code. So let's take a look at that. So we're going to make sure our application is running. It still is. And let's go ahead and open up Cypress. And then I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay, doing good. All right, so we do have a test now, so it should run. All right, so we visited our page. We have a test. So if we want to start writing some tests here and we want to get some elements, it's a couple different ways that you could do this, right? You could inspect it's in the browser. So the nice thing about Cypress running in a browser is you get access to all the dev tools in the browser as well. So whenever you're running Cypress in the test runner, you can also hop in here and see anything that's happening to the console. You can review network requests, which we'll do a little bit later as well. But, you know, instead of having to kind of dive in here and start taking a look at the DOM tree, you could just use the selector playground. So the Cypress selector playground, you can trigger it by clicking an open selector playground. And then you can click on elements or hover over them to see what type of selector Cypress would recommend. So in this case, you know, if you wanted to get the header, you can click on it. It'll pre-fill here, and we can copy it to the clipboard, go back to our test code, and just paste it there. So now when we save our test, Cypress automatically will rerun. It has hot reloading. So whenever you saved your test code or your application code, it'll rerun the test. And so now we can see that we are able to get the banner. And that passed. We don't have any assertions tied to it, but it passed. And if it wasn't there, then it would have failed. So the selector playground, it does have some kind of built-in selectivity. So it'll try and select the most specific selector that's available on the HTML element. So it can be a good tool to use if you don't necessarily have application to the test code or you're not sure what the best element to select is. And so I would recommend that's a really good tool for it to be able to kind of go in and start writing tests very quickly without having to evaluate the application code too much. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and close this. Let's go ahead and do our next activity. So we're going to spend about 5 minutes? That should be 10 minutes. We'll spend 10 minutes. Well, 5 to 10 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And we're going to have you go ahead and write a test that actually selects the DOM element. So if you write a test that visits the application, which you should already have from your last activity, selects the header banner and validates it contains the text conduit. And then select any other element on the page and validates the text or style of the element with an assertion. So again, I recommend using the assertions documentation and then the selector playground, if you like, in order to write a test that just selects and validates the header banner, but then any other type of element in the page. As a bonus, you can also use sci.contains to validate subheading or whatever the text that you'd like on the page. So yeah, so let's go ahead and take 5 to 10 minutes in order to spend some time writing that test. All right. So about 56. Okay, yeah, so that was pretty good. Again, if you have any questions on this activity, we are going to do, we're going to be doing 2 more activities in this section. So hopefully we're able to progress, but keep in mind too that the solution is on the activity 3 branch. So you can feel free to use that if you have any questions. So Tomas asked this question in the chat. So he gets, I don't know, he gets a cookie, a fake. So selector best practices. So we definitely recommend using HTML data attributes or custom data attributes in order to select. This allows you to essentially have the most specific type of selector. And it also makes your test less brittle because if the class changes or somebody changes an ID, or if you're using a component library that uses variable class names and you don't know what they're going to be at the time that the application renders. Yeah, sorry about that. Let me just go ahead and, so you can use the, these are all of the assertions. And then I'm also going to go ahead and share the API here. So these are all of the commands as well. So this is our API reference that has all of the commands and assertions. The only selectors are sci.get and sci.contains. Sorry about that. Just wanted to make sure that we had the information that we needed there. Okay, so like I said, we recommend using a HTML custom data attribute selector. So in this case, you can use data-sci. We also use data-test. But essentially what you do is you alter the source code and you say, in the HTML file, in the source code, you add the attribute data-sci, and that allows you to actually just get that specific element. So you say sci.get, and you pass through the syntax for a data selector, an attribute selector, and you say data sci equals submit. And this allows you to be much more specific with what you're selecting, and it reduces some of the variability in your tests. So that's a little bit like cumbersome to type, right? With the bracket and the equals and the does it need quotes or not. I know that I hate typing it out. So I recommend also using a custom command. So we won't dive too much into Cypress custom commands right now, but I mentioned earlier that in your support file, there's a commands.js, in your support folder, there's a commands.js file that allows you to write custom commands that you can use in Cypress. So by adding a custom command that allows you to kind of have that syntax already typed in and you just pass through the selector, it's a lot kind of easier on your typing. It's a lot easier, makes it less repetitive. So we see this in the Cypress Real World app. That's where these commands come from. So in the Cypress Real World app, in our support file, we have these commands. And you can see it's just get by selector or get by selector like. In this case, you're using a wildcard so that you can pass through part of the selector. You don't have to pass through the entire thing. In this case, we want it to be an exact match. And then we can see this in the test files. Let's just go to new transaction. So we can see here, get by cell like new transaction. So all we're doing is passing through new transaction, and then Cypress is going to look for any HTML that has element that has a data attribute that contains that new transaction. And we use that all throughout the test here. So get by cell like, get by cell like, get by cell. This one is going to be exactly alert bar success. So you don't have to type in that syntax each and every time. All right, so with that in mind, so those are the commands. Definitely recommend adding those to your commands.js file, and then you can just start using sci.getByCell, sci.getByLike, or getByCell like, and pass through that selector. So next activity, we're just going to take about 5 minutes here. So update your home.component.html to add a data site attribute to the header banner, and then rewrite your Cypress test to select using the data site attribute instead. So in our test code, we'll go into source, we'll go into our app, we're going to go into our home, and then home.component.html. And we can see here that we have this H1 element that has a class of logo font. That's how we selected the first time. So you can go ahead and add the data attribute there. And then back in your test file, instead of having your sci.get be kind of this selector from the playground or just the logo font, use the data attribute instead. So it'll take about 5 minutes and let y'all work through that. And I can take some time during that 5 minutes to answer any questions if anybody has them. And then again, if everyone could lower their hand, sorry, I forget to do this every single time. You can lower your hand and then raise it. Just remind me,
I have a button to push to lower everyone's.
Oh, okay. Oh, nice. Cool.
Now, there are a couple of questions around selectors that maybe would be good to address while we're doing this activity.
Perfect. Yeah, be great.
Okay, let me find them again. Okay, so you mentioned earlier we can use Mocha, Chai, or jQuery selectors. Is there anything we should keep in mind when choosing which one to use, or is it just personal preference / team experience?
Gotcha. Yeah. So Cypress actually uses all three of those. So Mocha is the test runner. So that's where you see the describe and the it blocks. That comes from Mocha. The assertions all come from Chai. So that's the should, expect, and the assert. Those all come from Chai. Now, within that, which you prefer to use, that depends. So should and expect are what are called the BDD assertions, and then assert is the TDD assertion. So it depends on your approach to testing. I primarily see the BDD assertions because this is driven by user behavior and user stories. So that typically tends to more align with it than the TDD assertions. But again, you can use any of them. And then the jQuery selectors, that is built into the sci.get. And so it essentially just gives you a lot of flexibility because it allows you to pass through like those wildcards and very specific types of selectors if you wanted to. But yeah, so the tools are all in there built in. And then as far as which versions of those that you use, whether it's describe or context or whether it's the BDD or TDD, that's going to depend on the strategy approach of your team.
Cool. So it's just ultra flexible.
Yeah.
Okay. Another one. What are selector best practices? We've been using data-cy. I think you may have already addressed that. This one was posted before that.
Yep, exactly. So data-cy, absolutely recommend doing that, or data-test.
Cool. All right, let's see. I think there's at least one other one here. Another question, I always recommend the use of data-QA tags instead of having our developers /QA select items from the DOM using IDs or classes. IDs and classes can change over time and be refactored. It is a known practice on my teams that once the data-QA attribute is set, it should not be changed without corresponding changes to an automation test. How do I select a DOM element if I add the following to an HTML? And he has a H1 class logo-font and then data-QA logo conduit.
Yeah, that's a great question. So definitely agree with that approach. I think that that's a really great best practice. I think that it promotes a good relationship too between like the developer and the test writer, the QA and the development team if there are separate separations of concern there. So the difference is let me go back to that custom command, actually, be the best place to explain it. So if you take a look at this custom command and how we're kind of passing the data-cy equals the selector. So you could just do data-QA equals logo at this point, right? So this part here is kind of arbitrary. You can do data- whatever you like. It can be data-cy, data-test, data-QA. As long as it matches up with whatever you're passing through to that selector, then that's what needs to be consistent. So yeah, so you would just essentially, instead of doing data-cy here, or maybe even better, actually, instead of data-cy here, it would just be data-QA. And as long as they match up, you'll be good to go.
Pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Another question, do you still get IntelliSense when you use custom commands?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that if you are using TypeScript, it'll still show it'll show the types and everything for custom commands, which is helpful to know what you need to what type of parameters it's expecting. But I don't know how robust it would be beyond that. That's a really good question. I'd have to find out that one for you and get back on that. Yeah. Oh, it looks like there's some stuff in the, yeah, okay. Yep, so it looks like you can add commands. Yeah, so see, I know that on TypeScript, like in real world app, we have all the types written out for the custom commands, and they do show like when you hover over them and everything. But I don't know if it's going to be as necessarily as robust as what you might get with the IntelliSense. So.
Right, and my experience with d.ts files is you get as much out of it as you put into it. So if you make it really awesome, then you'll get a really awesome experience out of it. If you just add the type, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it tells you what you can and can't do. I guess that's pretty much the point of the TypeScript, right? So, but yeah, so it does port everything over, though, and I do know that. So, awesome, good question. Okay, so looks like we have. If everybody could just raise their hands, as long as you're all set to move forward with this activity. Okay. Go back to the activity. And again, the solution is on activity 4, branch as well. Just want to get a couple more hands before we move forward. All right, looking good. So with the rest of the time that we're going to do some activities and instruction around Cypress commands and how they work. So there's this really great guide, again, in our documentation about interacting with elements. And this is essentially what we're working through in the slides right now. So the common commands that you'll use are click, type, clear, check, select, and trigger. There's a few more, like double click, right click, things like that. But primarily, I use these the majority of the time. Something to keep in mind, and I did mention this earlier, is that commands must be chained off of a command that yields a sci element. So you can think of it as it has to be chained off of a selector, like sci.get or sci.contains. So we talked earlier a little bit when one of the questions came up about how Cypress is kind of like a promise. It yields the object that is returned by the selector. And again, I shouldn't say the word returned. It yields the object that the selector finds. And then the command must be chained off of that selector, and that command will action on the element that was selected. So in a test, this would look like essentially, we see, sci.get the element and then a click on it, right? And that's going to click on the actual button itself. So as a best practice, sorry, 1 second. Just making sure something is set up here. So as a best practice, we recommend alternating commands and assertions in order to make commands retryable. So the way that works is, I mentioned earlier that Cypress has some built-in actionability checks. Just make sure that, okay. So Cypress has built-in actionability checks. And essentially what that means is that, like I said before, it won't do something unless the user can do it too. So what that means and what it does is, going back here into our actionability checks, Cypress will check these items. It'll scroll the element into view. It'll make sure it's not hidden. It'll make sure it's not disabled, detached, not read-only, animating, covered, or that it's and it is also at a certain coordinate. So if you try and click on a button that's behind a sticky header, it's not going to fire. If you try and type in an input that's disabled, it's not going to type. So again, Cypress is going to act like your user, and it's going to only do things that are actually actionable. So the other thing about Cypress commands is that they're also retryable. So as I mentioned before, it'll kind of keep going until a certain timeout period. So Cypress has a default timeout period of 4 seconds. I'm pretty sure it's 4. It's either 3 or 4 seconds. And what will happen is, and we can see this in the test runner as the command is running down. So when we run our test here on our sci.visit, we can see that the command was running down and it spins until it resolves. That's because there's a default timeout period. So what will happen is sci.get will keep trying to get this new to-do until it finds it. And if it doesn't, it'll fail. But it'll keep querying over and over and over again during that time period. So what we recommend doing, so as you probably may have seen, is like your application or a test runner can be a lot faster than a user. So if you think about what a user would do, is a user would get a new to-do, it's like a to-do app, and they would type it and they would hit enter. Then they would wait until that item appears on the screen before continuing, right? They're not going to try and delete the item that it doesn't exist yet. So Cypress also kind of needs to know to do that as well. So in this case, by saying sci.get should have a length of 1, by chaining this assertion directly off the sci.get, what will happen is if this should fails, so if we say our to-do list should have a length of 1 and it doesn't, it'll go back and do the get again. So it'll actually retry the entire chain over again until it passes on each command. So if you didn't have this connected, if you just said sci.get and you went directly to the should and it passes and fails, that's fine. Or I'm sorry, let's say you had a sci.get and then it should have length of 1 and then you wanted to just delete it, like delete the item. If you tried to do that without checking that the item is there first, it's going to fail because it's not able to find that item. By saying sci.get should have length of 1 before continuing, it's going to make sure that this actually is retried until it passes before continuing. So by stacking these and training these the right way, you make the entire chain retriable and it reduces the variability and flake in your test. So again, we have our sci.get and we're typing. So what you could do to make this even better is say sci.get new to do dot should, not have class disabled or should not be disabled before you type. Then it will only type in that element once we know for sure that it's not disabled. So that's a great trick to add for something like a button that only becomes enabled once you've typed in the username and password, for example. That could be a flaky test. If you said type username, type password, click sign in, but there's validation. And if you go to click sign in, it's still disabled because our application hasn't updated yet, then that test would fail when really there's not a problem. So you would want to do sci.get submit button should, not be disabled, then .click, and that'll make sure the entire thing passes. So best practice there for commands in alternating commands and assertions to make them retriable. And then also make sure that you keep in mind the actionability. Your Cypress will not action an element unless it has to. I'm sorry, if it can't. Now, if you have to, you can force things. So again, we don't recommend this unless there's something in your application that one thing that comes up a lot is a sticky header. So when we scroll the element into view and then sometimes like a header will pop over because of the action, then in that case, sometimes you have to just do a force true, which in this case will bypass the actionable checks and it'll just force it to go ahead and complete. Okay, so let's see where we are on time. Okay. All right, so activity 5. We're going to go ahead and write a test that actually tests some app functionality. So we already are visiting our application. If we look at the application, we're going to go ahead and, sorry, give me 1 second. Let me find it here, the live demo. So we're already logging in. We're going to navigate to the sign-in page. So you can see a sign-in here, username, password, and then we have a button. And again, this is an example of a button that you can't click until email and password is filled in. So we're going to have you visit the application, visit the sign-in page, use these credentials. They're case sensitive. And then once you're logged in, you're going to publish a new article. So once you're signed in, you'll be able to see a page in order to publish a new article. You can use any kind of just title, description, content tags you like. Don't worry about assertions yet. Just kind of use selectors and commands to write the test that goes through, that functions and handles that functionality. And so we are coming towards the, for the last 20 minutes or so of the hour. So we're going to be working on this all the way through until the break. Oh yeah, Joe, if you could lower the hands for the activity.
Done.
Awesome. So, and then as you complete the activity, feel free to raise your hand. If you finish early, feel free to go ahead and take your break. After this, we're just going to be doing the break and then the Q&A.
Do you want to hold off on Q&A for questions related to this activity, or would you like me to field those questions now?
Yeah, you can go ahead and throw those at me. We have quite a bit, so I want to make sure we have time to get through them.
Excellent. Okay, a couple that I've seen come through that are related to this particular topic. If an assert fails, will it try again until it passes? And is there a limit to the retries?
Yeah, so if an assertion fails, it will essentially do the default command, right? The default timeout. So if the assertion fails, it'll go back and it'll get it'll kind of redo whatever command it's chained to in order to make that retryable up until that default timeout period. So what you can do is if you have concerns about variability in the application, or if you have to wait for something to appear, you have a few different options. You can either increase the default timeout for that single command. You can also increase the default timeout across your entire test suite or kind of across different scopes of the application or the test code. However, what I'd recommend doing in that case, you can also leverage is test retries. So if you have assertions that pass sometimes and fail other times because of what we call flake. Talk about flake a lot, and there's a lot of different types of flake. The most common that I see is DOM instability related to things not appearing on the DOM the way that we expect them to at that time in the test. The other tends to be either environmental or API instability. So we're waiting for a resource to load and it never comes back and then everything fails. So in that second case, test retries can be really helpful because it's not that it could be just something specific to the test environment or something like that, where those failures are going to be very, very intermittent, but then that flake is going to be intermittent, but you don't necessarily want it to break your build, right? Or to break your deployment. So test retries can be helpful in that area because it allows you to say, okay, this test was flaky and we had to retry it, but we can quarantine that for next time and find out what's going on, or we can better decide, is this worth stopping the deployment for? Is it a real failure, or is it like a test failure, like a test code failure or flake? So when it comes to DOM instability and assertions related to that, you're better off kind of doing either waiting for something to happen on the back end. So saying, wait for this network request to finish first, or wait for this element to appear on the page first before proceeding with the test. So those are some, depending on the type of flake that you're experiencing, you can kind of leverage the timeouts or the test retries, but ultimately those tend to be eliminating issues with your application, right? Like if something is in the DOM and then it gets detached from the DOM, or it re-renders 10 times between clicking the button, or if a state is taking too long to update and the button never updates, then that could be something like a performance issue or a variability issue or like a hook issue with your application code. So don't always try to engineer around those too much if you can't, if you can help it. So
that makes sense. One other question. So the command find chained to get, does that make that find relative to the get element?
Yes. So find get will search within, kind of like a within that scope. So if we go to find in our documentation, so it gets the descendant DOM elements of a specific selector. So it matches exactly how find works in jQuery. So in this case, it'll yield footer within the class of article. Great question.
Another one that's somewhat related. Can Cypress assert on accessibility related information? For example, what a visual user would not see, but a screen reader would?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me see. I have a good blog post for that. one of our Cypress ambassadors wrote a really great blog post about testing accessibility with Cypress, Marie Drake. And so I'm just pulling that up because that is kind of my source of truth with Cypress and accessibility. So I can pop this in the chat too. But she did a 30 days of accessibility testing. And this is a really great breakdown of all the things that she did on it with it. But a lot of it was using Cypress as well, and talking about how you can really, what it has to do with is accessing the state of your application, right? And accessing some of the elements on those, on the HTML. So you can assert on any of the like ARIA role attributes, for example, and making sure that those are appearing properly. You can also make assertions on any kind of like CSS variables or state of your application. So if you're able to tap into the Redux, Vuex, NGRX, I guess everyone here's Angular, NGRX data store, then you can make assertions on that data store and make sure that, you know, you're setting things up properly there as well. So let me go ahead and pop this in the chat, this blog post. That would be a good resource there. And then make sure that we're raising your hand as we complete the activity as well. But yeah, great question. Accessibility testing is something that I think we get increasingly asked about like more and more. So it's definitely becoming more prevalent and more important.
Hopefully we didn't have too many that forgot to raise their hand and went on break.
Oh yeah, that's okay. I'll assume that they just finished early if they went on break already. Cypress tests, depending on how they're written, they should be written pretty English-like, you know, so sci.get, .should, .click, all this stuff, and you should be able to read it specifically. There is also, like I mentioned, a preprocessor that you can write your feature files, and you can have your cases, and you can have your step actions, and then Cypress will take that, and it'll, on its own, essentially take those and define and write and come up with the Cypress versions of those tests. So you can definitely utilize Cucumber syntax and feature files if you want to with Cypress. You just have to use a third-party plugin to make that work. But the readability of Cypress tests varies a lot from project to project. We have a lot of, I would definitely recommend using as many best practices with using custom commands whenever you can to abstract, so that to make it a little bit more readable. So for example, how we have it in the real world app, all of these commands here where we say get by cell, we have kind of sci.database, but we have a couple of custom commands in here that make it a little bit easier to, let's see, trying to get down to the actual tests here. So we have like a switch user command, right? And we have a couple of different things. Wow, we have so many selectors should be visible. So you can kind of use those and leverage those in order to make them more readable. But it's going to depend a lot, basically, like what you're used to, right? So a Cypress test could be readable to somebody who like this really knows JavaScript a lot and is very comfortable with that. But then if they never touched Cucumber, then a Cucumber test is not going to be as readable to them because they're not familiar with that Gherkin syntax. So I would say it depends a lot. There's a lot of variability there.
Okay. Thank you. So we're at 4 o'clock now. We have 23 more open questions. Are you going to have some time at the end to do more Q&A? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we can kind of do a similar thing where when we start off the last activity, just kind of start taking questions from there too during the activity time. So awesome. All right. So
welcome back, everyone.
Yeah. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and dive into the last hour of our workshop. So we're going to be talking a lot about assertions during this entire time, this last part of the workshop. So I'm going to talk about types of assertions. And specifically, when I talk about types of assertions, I mean the type of things that we assert on. So in my mind, there's 3 different kinds of categories of things that you make assertions on when you're writing a test. The first is that page elements render as expected. That is a broad category, but it could be things like the content of the application. You know, is the product name showing? Is the description text appearing? The style. You know, you can make assertions if you're not using visual testing and you want to make assertions on HTML attributes or classes or CSS, you know, classes in order to make sure things appear properly, or colors. You can also make assertions on visibility or actionability. So we talk about, you know, is an element being covered? Like, can I click on it? Does it work? Then the next thing we talk about is the user actions result in expected behavior. So if a user does something on the page, then the DOM should render a certain way or something else should happen, right? And so it could be that links go to correct URLs, that event listeners are firing correctly. If there's a modal that should pop up, that modal appears. So the functionality of the application are other things that we can kind of make assertions on. And then the last but definitely not least, and kind of something that I think people get a lot of value out of, especially with the end-to-end testing, is that making assertions that expected side effects occur. So these are things like making sure that HTTP requests go out with the proper headers, the proper body, depending on what the ID that you're passing through is, for example. Making sure that if you are doing a full end-to-end test and you're actually hitting a database, you can use side.node or side.exact side.task or side.exec in order to be able to access Node or the shell to make a ping to your database, or you can use hidden API to make sure that your database actually updated. So this is something that these are the different types of assertions that you can make and that you really should be making along the way as you go through your Cypress test. So this link here is kind of just goes to our best practice, is to add multiple assertions and don't worry about it. So if you're used to writing unit tests, the pattern is kind of get the element, make an assertion, get the element, make an assertion, and really just kind of doing it very granularly. But you can really have these kind of long tests where you say, the item, we should type it, and then we can say that it has all these different assertions. So we can assert on the DOM, we can assert on the HTTP request, and we can assert on a lot of different things all within one test and have a lot of assertions in there. So let's go ahead and add some assertions. Okay, we're gonna go into this a little bit more before we actually start the activity. So I mentioned before that there's two different types of assertions. There's the BDD and there's the TDD. But what I'd like to kind of focus on, again, is the types of assertions that we're talking about. So when you do this next activity, when you're adding the assertions, you're going to want to do some things to validate the DOM specifically. So when you look at our application, and again, the last time that we did something, when you click on sign in, that's an action, right? You took an application action. You clicked on something and something should have happened. So what are some of the things that we would assert on this page? So if we think of the first category, we have our assertions related to the DOM. So we may want to say, okay, sign in appears, right? That would be a big one if we're on the sign in page. But additionally, you may also want to assert that the URL is /login, right? That's something else that you want to assert on. So this can especially be helpful if you have a SPA that has routing handled internally on the front end, right? And the URL should change, but maybe you're not necessarily actually visiting a new URL like in the site, right? But you want that to appear correctly in the browser. So that's another type of assertion that you can make. Additionally, you could also make some assertions on if there's anything that was like any HTML requests that went out. So again, when we inspect our network requests, we can see when we run our application that, cool. We can see that it's down. Awesome. So yeah, anyway, we'll take a look at that a little bit later, figure out what's going on with there. So I want you to, when you're doing this activity, to think about the different types of assertions. I would say don't worry about network requests yet. I'm going to figure out what's going on with this API. I wonder if that's related to the issues that we were having earlier with the API being down. But go ahead and just add some assertions to the application, and then we'll be able to go along with that and reference them that. So we're going to take about 10 minutes. Additionally, I would say, as a bonus, how can you validate the value of the input fields? So again, if we think about the value and how you can make assertions on, properties of an HTML element, you can kind of make an assertion there. So we'll take about 10 minutes to work on this one here, and I will be definitely available for questions as you run through this. But be creative.
I just put everyone's hand down, so be sure to raise it when you're done.
Good job. Yes. Cool. Oh, yes. Perfect. That's a really good question. So the auth password for the app, let's go ahead and go to the last activity, and I'll go ahead and copy and paste these in the chat. Oh, thanks, Ramiro. That's awesome. All right. Okay, so we'll go ahead and add some assertions. And while everyone's working on this, like I said, we can raise your hand as you complete, and then we can go ahead and answer some more questions, Joe, if that's okay.
All right, next one. In Angular unit testing utilities, there's a when stable that allows you to wait for the change detection to finish running and all asynchronous tasks to finish before proceeding with the rest of your test. And Protractor also has a similar feature. So this person's wondering, does Cypress have anything similar that hooks into Angular's change detection cycle to just wait for everything to resolve?
Yeah, so there's not there's an open issue for that too. So there's not currently like a thing to say everything has stopped, right? But what we recommend is kind of making an assertion on whatever the last thing is that you're expecting to happen. So there's an open issue for that, and I can probably dive a little more into it, but I'll go ahead. For time's sake, I'll just say not currently, and we do have an open issue. So if you'd like to comment on that, feel free.
Okay.
I have kind of a... Okay. Yeah. So I want to go ahead and dive now. Let's see if everyone could just raise their hands if you finished. Do a last hand check. I feel like we'll probably have more than if we can get above 50, then I'll feel better. Awesome.
Oh, we're just...
Oh, we lost 50. One. Somebody said, oh, we're losing. No. All right. So if anybody has any questions, again, activity 6 is the branch with the solution on it. Hopefully a potential solution. Once we're, you can do this a lot of different ways. So, all right. Okay. I'll say we got to 50. I saw it happen. So we'll go ahead and move on. All right, so I'd like to talk about network requests. I'm very excited that we were able to stay on time because I wanted to make sure that we got to this. I know we've covered quite a bit, especially for people who are brand new to Cypress. So I appreciate all the great questions and interaction as we've gone along. So network requests and APIs. So first things first, I need to make sure that this application is still working because it wasn't working a second ago. So let's go ahead and open that up locally, just to confirm before we get too far with this. Sorry about the confusion. Okay, so all right, so there we go, our application, and then, yeah, so it looks like we may be okay. Yeah, so, okay, so it's working in the browser. That's good. So let's go ahead and go from there. All right, so network request. This is one of my favorite things about Cypress. I like the way that you can, yeah, it's essentially, Cypress has built-in functionality that allows you to tap into the network requests that are happening during your test run. So right now we have sci.route, which is our default, essentially functionality. We do have a route 2, which is under experimental support right now. The difference is that route allows you to have access to the XHR objects. Route 2 allows you to have access to everything at the network levels. And it also gives you a lot more control over how you set the routes and how you stub out the responses. That's still in experimental support, like I said. So I'm going to be working with the regular sci.route today. But I just wanted to make sure, point that out, because in the months to come, you may end up using route 2, which is probably going to get renamed. But so if you have anything here that doesn't fit your use case, for example, like GraphQL or WebSockets or waiting for static resources, those are all things that get resolved with route 2. So just you can feel free to take a look at that if it works better for your specific application. But what kind of the Cypress route or the Cypress server functionality does is whenever you run your sci.server command, you're saying, hey, Cypress, I want you to keep an eye on the network requests, and I'm going to tell you some things that I want you to keep an eye on specifically. So it allows us to spy and stub network requests for a variety of different functions. The use case that we're going to be looking at today is waiting for network request. So in this case, we say, hey, Cypress, there's a network request that's going to go out. I really want you to wait for it. And then once it runs, I'm going to want to validate something about it. So you can use the spying and stubbing of network requests to make assertions on network requests. That's when you would essentially spy and wait for a network request. But you can also stub responses out. So you could do this, for example, if you wanted to set up test state. So if you wanted to return a specific something from a response instead of actually hitting that API. If you wanted to bypass any third-party integrations, you would use stubbing in order to essentially mimic that part of the application running and tell your test code, yes, this happened. This is the response you got. It's exactly what you need to keep running your test. So this allows you to have a lot more control over what's happening in your tests and set things up the way that you want to set them up, and then also make those assertions that you need to do to make sure that, and not just the UI that's running properly and happening, but the interaction between your UI and then whatever API that you're hitting against or whatever network request that your application is making. So this is how we set it up. In our test code, we have to essentially start with a sci.server command. This is just a command that runs by itself, and it just enables response stubbing. So this is how you turn on the network request functionality within Cypress. Typically, we see this at the top of a test block, or if you are going to be doing this for every single test, then we'll see it in the before each hook. But you need to essentially do this before you can leverage it in your test code. So sci.server enables response stubbing, and then we use sci.route to define the routes that we want to watch for, and then whether or not we're going to stub it or not. So we use the same command for spying and for stubbing. We pass through, the method is optional. It's get by default. Really, the thing that you need primarily is the URL, and this is going to be the URL, the endpoint, the route that you want to watch or you want to stub. And then optionally, you can pass through a response parameter that essentially says, make the response this. So if we take a look at our documentation in the network requests guide, and we take a look at the routing example, this is exactly what we're looking at. So we can see here that we, if you take a look at this in our test code, we have aliasing these routes as well. Talked about aliasing earlier, so let's take a look and see what that looks like now. So again, you would do sci.route, method and response are optional. So you're passing through a URL, and then you only need to pass a method if it's not get. So if you're watching for a post request or a put request, and you only need to pass through a response if you actually want to stub the response to that request. So in our situation, it's going to look like this. So we have our sci.server, and then we're saying sci.route, and we're passing through get just to make it clear, but you don't have to do that necessarily. And we're saying /users. And so we're saying Cypress server. We've set you up, sci.server. Now this route, whenever we do a get request to /users, we want to save that as a variable called get users. And you can name that whatever you like. But essentially you're using this as command to save and name this request. So we're saving the network request as a variable. Then we can access that request once it occurs with sci.wait. So sci.wait is a command that you pass through a variable to, and you say, Cypress, I want you to wait until this request completes, and then I'm going to do something with it, or then you can progress with the test. So this is something that you can leverage, for example, if you know an HTML request, or sorry, you know an HTTP request is going out, and it's going and it's coming back with the assets that you need to load to the page. And maybe you have a really big file that you're waiting on, and you know that it's going to take a while before anything happens in the DOM. You may want to wait until that request resolves before you even proceed with the test, right? So if you know that that API call is going to take 10 seconds, instead of saying, hey, Cypress test, wait 10 seconds, say, hey, Cypress test, wait for this network request to resolve. And that's a lot less brittle. It's a lot more stable. It gives you that granular control. So how do we then assert on network requests? Because that's what we want to get to, right? We want to get to the point where we are able to make assertions on these requests. So what we do is this is the example here. So we set up sci.server, and we say, again, we have our route. Whenever we make a get request to our users, we are saving that as get users. So we can assert on a couple of different properties on the request, the URL, method, status code, and then the headers and body for the request and the response. You can use these a couple of different ways. You can say sci.wait, and then in that case, you're waiting for, and then you're grabbing that network request, and you're saying, its method should equal get, something like that. Or you can say, you can attach the should directly onto it and say like should have property status 201. So again, the way that you organize your assertions is very, that's up to the testing philosophy kind of at your organization. But you can kind of think of it as you have access to all of these different properties in that request, and then you can assert on those however you like. So if you need to know for sure that the ID that you just entered in when you logged in got sent through properly, you can make an assertion on the request body, right? So this allows us to have a lot more control over, essentially just allows us to tap into all the network activity that's happening when we run our test, and then say, this one, this one, this one, I want to watch. This one and this one, I want to watch, and I want to stub. And you can actually just have that all outlined on the top of your test. And then throughout your test code, say, okay, this is the one that I wanted to watch. I need it now. This is the one that I wanted to watch and stub. I need it now. And then you're able to proceed and either make assertions or use that data to have more control over what commands you run next. So I went through that pretty quickly. I know we don't have a ton of time, but we are going to do an activity based on this. So we're going to be asserting on network requests. So we're going to set up a sci.server, and then we're going to do a sci.route to watch the post request for our login endpoint. So the API for the application is a live application, or is a live API. So you can actually pass through the entire URL here when you make your, you set up your sci.route. So you would do sci.route. It's going to be a post request, right? And then here, instead of just being /users, you're going to do the entire URL. And what that will do is if you do an entire URL with the HTTPS, that's going to override the base URL. So so instead of just doing a /, like if you had your own API that you were running locally, because we're hitting an external API, we're going to do it this way. So you'll pass the entire URL, and then we say you want to alias the endpoint as login. And again, you alias using this as command. It sounds like as command, the as command. And then we're going to have you add a wait in your test for the network request. So again, that's going to look like this sci.wait. And then you're going to make an assertion. I have here that status is 200, but feel free to do something else if you like. And again, just so when you're running your test in Cypress, you do have access to the network requests. So if you have your test runner open while you're writing the test, which is really helpful because you get that instant feedback and they automatically rerun as you save, then you're also able to look at the network requests that are happening. So if we come in here, and the reason that we can kind of know what that's supposed to be, right, is when we go to sign in, we can see that those APIs are going out. Sorry, all these logins here. So awesome. Oh, looks like the API is back up. Nice, just in time. Excellent. All right, so let's go ahead and take some time and work on through that activity. This is the last activity. So sad. Time is going by so quickly. So please make sure that if you have any questions, yes, thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for pasting that in there. I'll go ahead and leave this up on the screen as much as I can, but we'll go ahead and take some questions as well.
All right. Next question. What are best practices for testing and comparing formatted dates?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Testing and comparing formatted dates. I mean, it's a couple of things that you could do. If it's just depending on how it's been formatted. I mean, you could do do a test on that. You could equal certain things. I know that you can also test on like, if the date is created, like if it's an object, like a date object, then you may be able to do certain assertions on that object, for example. I don't have any specific test cases, but there might be something in our examples, testing dates in our example repo.
All right, this next one is probably the question you came to this workshop for. How can you get more involved in the Cypress community? What is an ambassador?
Oh, yeah. Awesome. That's a really, really great question. So a Cypress ambassador is, let me pull this up, is essentially they're our community, right? They're people who use Cypress, they love Cypress, they advocate for Cypress. So we have our Cypress ambassadors page, which is cypress.io/ambassadors. I can go ahead and pop that in the chat as well. Yeah, so if you are interested in becoming an ambassador, so like I mentioned Marie, she wrote a blog post that about accessibility. We have information here, the ambassador program overview, and you can also learn more and apply. But it's pretty cool. You get a free Cypress Dashboard account. You get access to the ambassador Slack with us here at Cypress and things like that. So basically our goal, and we provide you kind of information or supplies and resources and support if you're doing meetups and things like that, or talks. So we really just want to kind of support and highlight what people are doing within the Cypress community. It's really great being able to be involved with a product or with a project that is open source and has just a lot of contributions from the community and people are excited about. So absolutely. And then you get some swag too. So, it's always good.
All right, next one. This person is curious when they can stub in before versus before each and kind of just stubbing in general.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I would say you would stub in a hook in before or before each, depending on whether if you would use it in before each, if you know that you want to run that like every single test. So if you know for every single test that you're going to want to watch a certain endpoint, then yes, like define that in the before each hook. And that's the same thing as copy and pasting that at the top of each of your if blocks. If you are going to do it in a before hook, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that unless there's something that you need to do. For example, if you want to just like validate the API before you start your test and say, hey, make a request to this API and its response should be 200. That's something that, and if not, then fail and don't proceed, right? That's something that you could do in a before hook, for example. So yeah, good question there.
Okay. Next, how can I go to a page? How come I can go to a page using sci.visit/login, but not sci.visit/editor?
It just depends on if that page exists. So I'm not sure if there is like a /editor or if that's something that you need to be logged into. So that might be what it is. If you go to /editor and it may just be redirecting you to the login. But you should be able to visit any page that exists on that base URL.
Okay. Suppose we have to write lots of tests on our homepage. How do you suggest that we divide them? What about putting sci.visit/ in a before each without repeating it?
Yeah, exactly. So sci.visit in the before each, excellent best practice. Highly recommend doing that. There's anything that you can abstract out that way, especially if maybe you even make it a custom command, right? Where you log in and you go to the home page and that's in your before each hook. So yeah, great best practice.
Okay. Sorry, there's a couple of questions we already answered, so I'm just clearing them out.
Thank you. There's a lot of questions.
Yes, this has been a really great group here. Okay, next one. How do we use Cypress to test HTML with Canvas, typically a third-party component? Which is the best practice to do that?
Yeah, so there is a blog post on testing HTML Canvas with Cypress. This came up the other day. So it depends. There's a couple of different things that you can do, right? Because it's its own kind of element. So there is a blog post here that have had people refer to and say that they've had success with it. So I'm going to go ahead and pop that in the chat as well. Oh, sorry, pasted it twice.
The blog's so nice, it named it twice.
Yes. Just wanted to make sure everybody got it.
All right. Awesome. The next one, they posted some code. So if you want to take a look at that top question there, this doesn't work for me. Sci.get, and then it looks like it's kind of a CSS selector maybe generated from
the
DevTools or something like that has a whole bunch of direct child.
Gotcha. Yeah, I see it. The Feliga.
But if you do the sci.contains new article.click, it works. Any questions about that?
This could be an actionability issue. So sometimes we see sometimes where when you go to click on something in the selector playground, and you may have experienced this before. A lot of times with modern UI libraries, they'll have multiple elements kind of stacked on each other, and only one of them actually fires that click, right? So it may have like a div and then a span and then the actual button and then like the text on top of the button. And it's so it may be that when you're using the selector playground or when you're going to select the element, you're selecting part of the element that isn't actually where that click is fired off of. So we've seen this a lot of times with component libraries. So what you kind of need to do is figure out which element is the one that actually will generate that click. And so, yeah, and then Simon says here, it doesn't play too well with the Angular CSS encapsulation. So whenever you have things that are kind of, that extra level of kind of CSS variability. That's why, again, we recommend using data attributes because that bypasses all of that. It doesn't matter what the component library is doing, all that, things like that, right? So you're able to add that HTML element, the data sci attribute, right on the element that you know is tied to that click event, and you know it's going to fire no matter what. So,
yeah, and you know when you're doing user end testing, basically. I mean, the user's not going to be like, oh, okay, I'm going to look in the container for the nav and the second child. Like your tests, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, they should read more like what the user would be experiencing as they go through your application.
Yeah, exactly. So the selector playground is nice, and it's definitely a good way to kind of like get used to understanding how that process works and kind of finding things if you don't have access to the code base. But as a best practice, absolutely go with that data attribute, get exactly the element that you need. Yeah.
Okay.
Great questions.
Next question. What's the way of handling multiple browser tabs in Cypress? Most of the time, this use case is needed when the user clicks an anchor that opens in a new tab. Then the users want to switch to that tab to verify that that content loaded. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, multiple browsers is or browser tabs is one of the kind of limitations that we do have recipes. Here we go. Tab handling and links. So this is how you can kind of handle tabs that open in a new window and bypass that and kind of work around that. So, oh, that's weird. Sorry about that. There we go. So there's an example and some kind of best practices around that.
All right, cool. Next one, is there a way to test the look of the app while testing Cypress, like the button is in the right place?
Yeah, so the look of the app, again, I recommend using a visual testing, some kind of plugin or like Apple Tools or Percy or one of the snapshot diffing for that level of granularity, like if the exact location. Otherwise, you can assert on its coordinates if you want to, but I don't know if I would recommend anybody put themselves through that and asserting on the coordinates of each and every element on the page. So
right, and I mean that makes your tests and kind of going so back brittle. To why some people absolutely hate end-to-end testing to begin with is maybe because you've made your tests too brittle that they're not going to survive any code changes.
Absolutely. Yep. Great point there.
Okay, next one. I think this one was already answered, but it says, does Cypress have the ability to mock HTTP requests?
Yeah, absolutely. So we would just pass in that response parameter on the side.route, and then you'll be able to kind of mock or stub whatever the response would be for that request.
Okay. And then also there's another one that says, what about using a mock server instead of fixture data?
Yep. So same thing. Essentially, that's what the route does. You don't have to access a fixture. You can just mock that server out with the response. So. And just fixture data can be easier. So,
okay. Next one. Is it possible to query some endpoint for data in before all and reuse that data in multiple it blocks, maybe using aliases?
Yeah, so we do this in the, yeah, absolutely. So exactly. So you would essentially say, you can like do the wait, and then you would alias it, and then you can access those. So you would want to do it like in a before each hook, and then you can access those aliases throughout the test in order to do whatever you want with it, right? Make assertions, things like that.
Okay, this person.
Is this a really great question?
This person must have made this question right after you said that there was lots of great questions. They asked, "Is this question a really great question?"
Yeah. It's okay. It's okay.
All right. What about network requests with specific parameters, body, query string, path? Can we provide a function to match the request instead of a string?
Yeah, so that's where route 2 is going to come in handy for you. So again, this is experimental support currently, but it allows you to have a lot more granularity because you can pass through like a route handler and a route matcher argument. So the route matcher is, you can essentially, what this kind of came, a lot of use cases is for GraphQL, to be able to say, this is what the actual like request is, and then have more granularity over it to be able to match those specifically, as opposed to just a single endpoint, right? For GraphQL, that's not very helpful with regular route. So that's what route 2 brings that functionality to the table.
That's pretty cool. And just as a reminder, if you're going to go ahead and raise your hand if you're done with the activity.
Yes, thank you.
I'll get a few more that are done. Okay. All right, next one. Can you use .as for elements returned from selectors?
Yes, that is the other use case. So one of these, here you go, variables and aliases. So this is one of the other use cases, right, is for the return values. So this talks about how you can't really get the return value by assigning it to a variable. So this won't work, right? Button.click. So instead, what you can use is aliases, right? So you can, excuse me, you can either do that as a returning the element and then saving it as a variable to be able to share context. So you can say, get the button, invoke the text as text, and then you can say like this .text is now available. So you can take whatever the value you want from that. You could also do it for the entire thing if you wanted to get the entire button. And then you would say, you know, and maybe you would alias it as button, and then you would say button.text, as opposed to in this case, we're saving just the text. But you could also do the button and then save the button as button and then do button.text equals, right? That way. So
cool. All right. Can Cypress be used to add a delay to request responses and validate the behavior of the app while waiting for the response?
Yes, it can. Yes, it can. So let me see if I can. I know we have an example for this. Oh my gosh, there's so many. I shouldn't have lifted that screen. Yeah, so there's ways to definitely like basically resource loading. Yeah, yeah, let me find it though. I'm going to find it in a different window because I'm going to do some Googling here. Well, I guess I think it's in our docs, but yes, there absolutely is a way to do that. I just have to find the example for it. But essentially, let's see, delay. Slow request. Yeah, how to, let's see. Download a PDF file. Debugging, timeouts. All right, we'll move on to the next question. I'll look for it, and then I'll see if I can find it and put that out. Simulating network delays. Okay. Sorry,
all right,
Joe,
we're down to the last 5 questions. Maybe some more will keep on rolling in, but we've gotten through a lot here. Is there a recommended folder structure for everything inside the Cypress directory, including within the integration directory?
Yes. So folder structure, you can. So I will say that you can also override the folder names with the Cypress configuration. So in the Cypress real world app, I keep coming back to this because that's the best, but you can see this in our Cypress.json. Because we have API and UI tests, we didn't think that the integration was the best folder name, right? So we've set the integration folder here to be Cypress/tests instead. So you can override all these values if you do want to change any of your folder names. So, and in this case, we have our tests. The rest of the folder structure here is going to be pretty consistent. You know, you always have your fixtures, your plugins, your support, and your tests. You can, however, in here, commands.ts, for example, you could have multiple command files if you wanted. So if you wanted to split out your commands based on the different areas of the text that they're being, or different areas of the text that they're being used, and say, these are the commands related to our user page. This is the commands related to settings. These are the commands related to admin. You could break those out in order to have more control and granularity when updates happen. But typically what I tend to see a lot is you have like a main test folder, and then you may have the different types of tests, but then your spec files will be broken out. In this case, we don't have a lot of different, they're pretty long spec files, but I've also seen people have folders where they group up, they group the folders because that allows them to pass through globs to run only certain parts of the test at a time. So in this case, if we can do this here with passing a spec, that you can do --spec and then just pass the spec file if you only wanted to run the transaction feeds test. You can also do this in the Cypress test runner UI by selecting a specific spec file. But I've also seen people where they say, well, I want to group all of my transactions. Let's say we had transaction feeds, view, and new transaction. And we say, I want my transaction tests to be together. So they may have a folder that says transactions, and then they have the spec files in there. And then they could pass the glob that just says transactions / and then the asterisk, and that'll run all of their transaction spec files. So I definitely recommend that if you are going to do like grouping, to have it either be tied to the functionality of your application or to the different like areas of your application.
All right, thank you. Next one is, I'm just going to paraphrase this one. So it's kind of about the balance between replacing all your manual tests with Cypress versus doing some integration tests that may run faster. Any guidance on where you would strike that balance?
Yeah, gosh, it just depends so much on the strategy, right? It's just, so what I see a lot of is if there's a core end-to-end functionality that you just know has to work all the way across, right? So like if it's like going to your website, adding something to your cart, making a payment, and making sure that like, and doing that, right? And for you, it's very, very worthwhile to have a full end-to-end test that hits all the integrations to make sure that that works. I've seen people say it is worth the resources and effort to do all of that together. But a lot of people are able to do a combination of UI, integration, API, and unit tests, right? And then get the same, or if not exactly the same, then close enough of that level of coverage and confidence. Because really it's about confidence that what you're deploying is going to work and that you're not going to have regressions, right? So it just really depends on like the risk tolerance and how much control you really need to have over those certain core functionalities. So I see a lot of I typically recommend you do something like contact testing for your integrations, and then you have your UI tests, and that may also hit your API, but that's going to be your entire, like the kind of flow of your application. And then you may have separate API tests as well. But in the Cypress Real World app, we were able to get 100% API coverage using our UI tests. So it just really depends on the application, what your priorities are as an organization for testing, and then letting that kind of dictate where you go from there. Cool. So it depends. It's a long, short way of saying it. It depends.
All right. This is a follow-up question about the ambassadors. Is there any mentorship via the ambassadors? I would love Cypress and would love to grow into something like an ambassador.
That's a really good question. I do know that we have like a Cypress Slack channel for the ambassadors and everything that we interact with a lot. I don't necessarily know if that's like a functional part of the program itself, like if that's rolled in, but I do know that like the people who run it are super, super nice. So if you want to email them questions or reach out to that team, you're like more than welcome to. Let me just I think that they'll be open to just confirming anything or pointing you in the right direction. Yeah.
All right. Next one is a code question about why one thing works and the other doesn't. So the one that works is sci.way at login. Its status should equal 200. And this one, errors sci.way at login should have property status 200.
Okay, I'm looking at that now. Its status should have property. Okay, so it looks like it's because the response type doesn't have that property on it for some reason. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure why that's happening. Sorry. I could definitely take a look at it in more specifics, but we have about 5 minutes left. So sorry.
Okay, 2 more questions. I think we can do this. You mentioned earlier testing an application that uses NGRX with Cypress. As we've seen, there are lots of examples. Is there an example you could quickly point out? Feel free to call me out as lazy.
No, actually, so I would say I'm doing a talk later on this week at ng-conf about testing NGRX specifically. So there is I can actually share the repo for that probably while you answer the next question.
Well, and the next question is actually almost the same. I don't know if anyone has already asked. I'm interested if RxJS and NGRX can be tested. If so, please send me an example.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me go ahead and share. This is a sneak peek. Those are my slides for Thursday. And just, and there's a repo there too. So sneak peek. I'll talk, and then keep an eye out on Thursday for my actual talk on it. So awesome. So I'm sharing my screen with some resources here too. They're also on the slides, but we have a lot of documentation. We have our Gitter community chat. We have the real world application. Definitely recommend that. And then, Cypress is on GitHub or open source. You can post issues if you have any feature requests or if you have any bugs. Otherwise, Gitter is the best place to get interactive kind of feedback from the community. So
awesome.
We
got through all 69 questions. Good job.
All right. Great questions, everyone. I know I said that all the time. It's but they really were great. They really were great questions. So awesome. Yeah. So I will say that again, all the solutions for the activities that we covered are on the branches for the repository. And yeah, the next steps is just using the documentation, start using Cypress. Like I said, you don't really have to delete anything else. You can just start building on top of what you already have. And yeah, thanks so much for all the awesome questions and interaction. Makes my job a lot easier. So.
All right. And we have one final poll question for anyone who'd like to participate. What do you think Cecelia does when she's not coding?
Oh, wow. This is a good one. I'm not going to answer it. So I won't say. Oh, and I wanted to also give a shout out to Joe, who has been amazing as a moderator. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
I feel bad because I don't think that you got any breaks either. But
no,
thank
it's okay.
you for sticking.
I'm not used to having breaks. I'm a manager. I have meetings all day.
Yeah, gotcha. I'm used to like the somebody's like, oh, I'm running a few minutes late for a Zoom, and I'm like, awesome. Now I'm gonna get a coffee. Like this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, just a quick question in the chat. Are there any webinars for advanced topics? Yeah. So I put in the chat earlier the Cypress Patterns and Practices webinar link. That is a really, really good one for more advanced topics. That goes over programmatic it goes over customizing the command line. And I'm just grabbing it again here. And it also goes over CI. So like integrating with CI. So and that's done by Amir and Kevin from our DX team. Highly recommend that work, that as well. So I'm putting the YouTube link and the slides in the chat there. So that's, yeah. So if you're already up and running with Cypress, and this was like kind of like refresher for you, Patterns and Practices is a great next step.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to end the poll in 5 seconds. So finish up your vote if you haven't already.
And then I also just wanted to say, if anybody has any questions for Cypress, success@cypress.io is our kind of default email address that you can reach out to, and chances are it'll be me that gets it. So
All right, Cecelia, this is what we've got to do as soon as we're done. You got to do some cooking, baking, and playing border video games.
Okay, the video games and board games is absolutely correct. I have to give a shout out to Functions and Dragons.
Awesome.
It's like a Tuesday night D&D group. Highly recommend checking that out on Twitch. But yeah, cooking, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
And actually, I guess this is a good chance to plug. We're going to, on Friday, do a virtual board game for this conference. Oh, you can't see it because of Zoom.
Yeah, the screen.
But this is a roll and write game that can basically support unlimited characters, and I'm going to be running that. So
awesome.
Be sure to go to that. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Joe. This was a very excellent workshop experience. Appreciate it.